Hi there, it's a Frankenstein coming out to you with the second edition of the prototype. Hope everyone is doing okay today. So this edition is an extension of the first episode that I've done in this video series. Today's topic that I'll be covering is fragrance type. Now, what do we mean by fragrance type? Every fragrance falls in a specific category of fragrances or fragrance profile. That's what effectively people are alluding to when they mean fragrance type. While most of the fragrance types are easy to deduce, for instance, based on their name. For instance, if we're talking about sweet fragrances or floral fragrances, the added adjective kind of gives away what kind of fragrances we're talking about. A sweet fragrance will eventually be sweet. Floral fragrance will have floral undertones and overtones. But what about the wayward terminologies? Now, as you will progress in your fragrance game, you will inadvertently come across these terminologies. So today I'll be shedding some light on these quote unquote obscure terminologies of type of fragrances. If you want to hear more about these, stay tuned. The first type of fragrance that I'll be expanding on are fougere fragrances. Now, fougere fragrances have been around for quite some time now, I think since the late 1800s. A great historical starting point of what a fougere fragrance is would be Houbigant's Fougere Royale. Now, the perfumer behind this timeless classic of a fougere fragrance, the concept behind it was to replicate the smell of fern. And as you all know, the fern does not have a particular smell, so it's a fictional note of fern. Simply put, if God ever gave a fern a smell, this is the type of fragrance that it would smell like. The main components of a fougere fragrance is tonka bean, lavender, and oak moss. Now, over the years, the definition of fougere fragrance have greatly changed. A more modern rendition of what a fougere fragrance is would be what you smell when you enter a barbershop. So the classic smell of a barbershop is what effectively is a modern version of a fougere fragrance. Now, I've already given you an example of what a fougere fragrance is, Houbigant's Fougere Royale. A more modern example would be Azzaro's Pour Homme, and also Jaipur Pour Homme, Eau de Toilette, and Eau de Parfum, strictly because they're barbershop type fragrances. Now, on to the second type of fragrance, which is chypre fragrances. Now, what are chypre fragrances? Chypre fragrances primarily has citrusy top note and a middle hard note of cistus labdanum, and animalic mossy notes derived from oak moss. Now, you may wonder what cistus labdanum is. Cistus labdanum is a synthetic element that is supposed to smell like amber, so kind of a sweet base. Now, the smell that chypre fragrances are supposed to replicate is the smell of nature, shrubs, earthy, muddy smell. I think the smell of forest is a great description of what a chypre fragrance is. A good example for chypre fragrance would be Issey Miyake's Le Bleu de ses Pour Homme. This effectively smells like forest to me. When it's raining, after a rain, you're taking a walk, and this is what a forest smells like. So it just ticks off all the criteria of a chypre fragrance. Also, a timeless classic example would be CK1. On to the third type of fragrance, which is gourmand fragrances. Now, these are simply put fragrances which are supposed to invoke emotions of edibility, something that you'd like to eat when you smell. Now, in fragrances, resonating these type of emotions predominantly comes in sweet fragrances, and people tend to confuse and get misleaded of what a gourmand fragrance is, because they think only sweet fragrances are supposed to be gourmand fragrances. while it may be true that Jean Paul Gaultier's Ultramol and Paco Rabanne 1 million are great Gourmand fragrances because of that bubblegum note and that juicy pear note, I would like to add that fragrances like Queer Cafe, which smells like coffee beans, roasted coffee beans, which it does have a bit of sweetness in it, but predominantly it's that coffee bean. So this also, in my world, sits in the gourmand territory. So the key word for gourmand fragrance is anything that is edible, anything that you feel like you can consume is a gourmand fragrance. Doesn't have to be sweet, it can be sour. And now I'll be covering the more modern type of fragrances that's out there. I think Freshies is the umbrella that these two type of fragrances fall in. Freshies are fragrances which are supposed to make you feel rejuvenating, fresh and refreshing. So the first type of fragrance that falls under this umbrella are blue fragrances. Now there's blue fragrances have effectively taken the market by storm, and the examples would be Dior Sauvage, Bleu de Chanel, and you can tell from just these two examples what I'm referring to. Blue fragrances are supposed to emulate the smell of shower gel. That's what blue fragrances are. I think people are well educated on the subject of blue fragrances, so I'm going to skip that. And another type of fragrance that is coupled with it is aquatic fragrances, fragrances that effectively give you the smell of sea. Fragrances like Nautica Voyage and also Bulgari's Aqua Amara, and the list goes on. Now the bonus type of fragrance that I want to throw in there is an unclassified type. So what do I mean? Now this kind of fragrance could range from any number of fragrances that are out there, since perfumery is evolving and so are the different type of fragrances and the definitions associated with it. For example, fragrances like this, fragrances like Baccarat Rouge, even though it gives a strong cotton candy vibe, I wouldn't place it on the gourmand territory or any of the aforementioned type of fragrances, simply because of the woody note and the synthetic play of notes that comes into play. This is a genre of its own, and that is understandable when perfumery is evolving and creating new domains of fragrances. I hope this little educational video, if you want to call it, has been particularly helpful to you. And as always, the Frankenstein has spoken.